The small town of Cedarville, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, was a place where time seemed to stand still. Rolling hills stretched across the horizon, and the streets were lined with quaint homes, each adorned with flower-filled gardens and white picket fences. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. And the biggest scandal of the year was Mrs. Thompson's pie losing at the county fair. For Emma Carter, Cedarville was home, though it hadn't felt the same since the accident. At just 11 years old, Emma had experienced a loss that no child should ever endure. Her mother, Laura, had been the glue that held their small family together. But a car crash on a rainy night had changed everything. Now it was just Emma, her father David, and Max. Max was no ordinary dog, a German shepherd with sharp amber eyes and a coat that gleamed in the sunlight. Max was a therapy dog, a gift from David in the months following Laura's death. David, a former police officer, had trained Max himself, knowing that Emma needed more than words to heal. Max wasn't just a pet, he was a guardian, confidant, and the one constant in Emma's ever-changing world. It was a quiet evening in late autumn when the first sign of trouble appeared. The sun had dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the Carter backyard. Emma was in her room, sketching in her notebook, while Max lay at the foot of her bed, his ears twitching occasionally at the faint sounds of the evening breeze. Then came the noise. Faint rustling, almost imperceptible, came from outside. Max's ears perked up instantly, and he lifted his head, sniffing the air. Emma looked up from her drawing, her brow furrowing. "What is it, Max?" she whispered. The dog didn't respond but leaped off the bed, his movements fluid and purposeful. He padded toward the window, his nose pressed against the glass as a low growl rumbled in his throat. Emma's heartbeat quickened. She climbed out of bed and followed Max to the window, peering out into the dimly lit yard. First, she saw nothing. The backyard stretched out into the woods, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But then, she noticed it, a shadow moving near the old garden shed at the edge of their property. It was quick, almost fleeting, but it was enough to set her nerves on edge. "Dad!" Emma called out, her voice trembling slightly. David appeared moments later, his tall frame filling the doorway. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but alert. Emma pointed toward the window. "There's someone out there, near the shed." David frowned and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. "Stay here," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. Max, however, had other plans. As David opened the back door, Max bolted outside, barking loudly as he sprinted toward the shed. "Max!" Emma cried, but the dog was already halfway across the yard. David followed, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Emma stood frozen at the window, watching as her father and Max approached the shed. The beam of the flashlight swept across the yard, revealing nothing but fallen leaves and the faint outline of the shed. But Max's barking didn't stop. He circled the shed, his nose to the ground, growling and barking as if he were chasing an invisible intruder. David opened the shed door cautiously, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. Inside, everything appeared untouched. Garden tools hung neatly on the walls, and bags of soil were stacked in the corner. But Max didn't relent. He sniffed around the base of the shed, his growls growing louder. David knelt beside Max, running his hand over the dog's back to calm him. "There's nothing here, boy," he murmured, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Emma, unable to stay put any longer, stepped outside, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "What is it?" she asked as she approached. David shook his head. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his tone was unconvincing. He stood and closed the shed door. "Let's get inside." Max hesitated, his eyes fixed on the shed as if he could see something they couldn't. But at David's command, he trotted back toward the house, his tail low and his ears still alert. That night, Emma struggled to sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Max rested at her side. Something about the shadow near the shed unsettled her. It wasn't just an animal. She was sure of it, but without proof. She knew her father would dismiss it as her imagination. As the town of Cedarville slept, a storm brewed quietly in the shadows, one that would change Emma's life forever. The following morning, the sunlight filtered through Emma's window, but the unease from the previous night lingered. She watched Max from her bed as he paced near the back door, his behavior still restless. "What's wrong, boy?" she asked, but Max only whined softly, his gaze fixed on the shed in the yard. David, already dressed for work, sipped his coffee while scanning the morning paper. He noticed Emma's worried expression as she joined him at the kitchen table. "Still thinking about last night?" he asked. Emma nodded. Max hasn't stopped acting strange. What if it wasn't just an animal? David sighed, placing his cup down. "Emma, sometimes dogs pick up on things that aren't there. He might have smelled a raccoon or a stray cat. There's no need to worry." Emma wasn't convinced, but she knew better than to argue. "Okay," she muttered, though her mind was racing. She had learned long ago to trust Max's instincts. He was rarely wrong. Later that day, while David was at work, Emma decided to investigate on her own. She grabbed a flashlight and coaxed Max to the backyard. The morning chill had given way to a crisp afternoon, and the golden autumn leaves crunched under her sneakers as she approached the shed. "Let's see what you're so worked up about," she whispered to Max. He wagged his tail slightly, but his ears remained pricked as he sniffed the ground. Emma opened the shed door cautiously, the hinges creaking again. Everything appeared normal at first glance, just as it had the night before, but Max's behavior said otherwise. He began sniffing around a pile of old gardening tools in the corner, his tail stiff as a low growl escaped him. Emma knelt beside him, pushing the tools aside. Beneath them, she spotted something odd. A torn piece of fabric caught on a nail. The fabric was dark, smeared with dirt, and looked as though it had been ripped from clothing. Emma's heart raced as she picked it up. "What is this, Max?" she murmured, holding it up to the light. Max barked sharply, startling her. It wasn't the playful bark she was used to. It was a warning. Realizing this could be important, Emma stuffed the fabric into her jacket pocket and hurried back to the house. She knew she should tell her father, but something stopped her. David had been dismissive before, and she didn't want him brushing this off as another imagination moment. Instead, she decided to hold onto it for now. That evening, while Emma worked on her homework at the kitchen table, David received an unexpected call. "Henry Whitman?" he repeated, his voice tinged with surprise. Emma looked up, curious. David covered the receiver and said, "It's about the shed. Someone in the neighborhood reported seeing Henry near our property a few nights ago." Emma frowned. She knew Henry Whitman, a mechanic who had repaired their car once. He was tall, gruff, and always seemed to be on edge. "Why would he be near our house?" she asked. David shrugged. "No idea. The police are going to question him. But don't worry, okay? It's probably nothing." Emma nodded, but her gut told her otherwise. She remembered how Henry had made Max uneasy the one time he came to their house. Max had growled softly the entire time Henry was around, and Emma had to hold him back by the leash. The next day, Cedarville buzzed with news of the police questioning Henry. Some townsfolk defended him, saying he was a hardworking mechanic who had fallen on hard times. Others whispered about his gambling debts and how he'd been caught in shady dealings before. The rumors made their way to Emma as she overheard a conversation at school. "Did you hear? They think Henry might have been involved in a break-in," one boy said. Emma's ears perked up. "Which house?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Don't know, but I heard the cops found some weird stuff in his truck." The pieces began to click in Emma's mind. Could Henry have been the shadow near their shed? She thought about the torn fabric in her pocket, wondering if it could somehow connect to him. That evening, David returned home looking tired. The police talked to Henry. he told Emma as they ate dinner. He denied everything. Of course, they didn't find enough evidence to hold him. Emma swallowed hard. Do you think he did it? David hesitated. I don't know. He's been in trouble before, but without solid proof. It's just speculation. Emma glanced at Max, who lay at her feet. Max doesn't like him, she said softly. David chuckled. Max doesn't like the mailman either. But Emma wasn't laughing. Deep down, she trusted Max's instincts, and she was determined to prove that he was right. As the sun set over Cedarville, Emma felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She knew this was only the beginning. Something wasn't right, and with Max by her side, she vowed to uncover the truth no matter what it took. The following morning, Emma woke up with a sense of determination. She couldn't shake the feeling that the torn fabric she'd found in the shed was connected to Henry Whitman. As Max stretched beside her bed, his tail wagging faintly, Emma reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of cloth. This is a clue, isn't it, Max? She whispered, holding it out to him. Max sniffed the fabric, his ears twitching as if confirming her suspicions. Emma knew she needed to act, but she couldn't do it alone. If her father wouldn't listen, she'd have to find someone who would. At school that day, Emma confided in her best friend, Lily. The two girls sat together during lunch. Their voices hushed as Emma recounted everything that had happened. The noise in the yard, Max's reaction, and the torn fabric. So you think Henry Whitman broke into your house? Lily asked, her eyes wide. Emma nodded. I don't have proof yet, but Max is never wrong. He knows something, and I think this fabric is connected to him. Lily frowned, tapping her fingers on the lunch table. What if we look into it ourselves? My brother has a friend who works at the gas station where Henry goes all the time. Maybe he's seen something. Emma hesitated. Investigating on their own sounded risky, but it also felt like her only option. Okay, she agreed, but we have to be careful. That afternoon, after school, the girls headed to the gas station, with Max trotting beside them. The station was on the outskirts of town, a small, weathered building with a single pump. Inside, a teenage boy named Caleb stood behind the counter, scrolling on his phone. Hey, Caleb, Lily said, flashing a friendly smile. We have a question. Caleb glanced up, raising an eyebrow. What's up? Do you know Henry Whitman? Lily asked. Caleb leaned back against the counter, his expression wary. Yeah, I know him. Why? Emma stepped forward, holding the piece of fabric in her hand. Do you recognize this? It's from my house. I think Henry might have been there. Caleb frowned, taking the fabric and examining it closely. Looks like the kind of stuff Henry uses to wipe down cars. He always has rags like this in his truck. Emma's heart raced. Do you think he could have been near our house recently? Caleb hesitated, glancing out the window as if to make sure no one was listening. Look, I don't know for sure, but Henry's been acting weird lately. He's been coming in late at night, buying cigarettes and gas, and he looks nervous, like he's hiding something. Emma exchanged a glance with Lily. This was more than she had expected. Thanks, Caleb, she said, tucking the fabric back into her pocket. You've been really helpful. Just be careful, Caleb warned. Henry's not the kind of guy you want to mess with. That evening, Emma returned home feeling both anxious and energized. She had more pieces to the puzzle, but it still wasn't enough to convince her father or the police. She needed solid evidence. As she sat on her bed, thinking about her next move, Max suddenly perked up. He jumped off the bed and ran to the window, barking loudly. Emma followed, her heart pounding. Outside, she saw a figure moving quickly past their yard. The figure was heading toward the woods, carrying what looked like a large bag. Dad! Emma shouted, running down the stairs. David appeared in the living room, alarmed by her tone. Someone's outside, heading toward the woods, she exclaimed. David grabbed his flashlight and coat. Stay inside, he ordered, But Emma wasn't about to let him go alone. She grabbed Max's leash and followed her father out the door before he could stop her. The cool night air bit at Emma's skin as she and Max trailed behind David. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees ahead. They followed the faint rustling sounds until they reached a clearing. There, near an old, abandoned cabin, they spotted the figure. It was Henry. He was crouched near the cabin's entrance, digging through the bag he'd been carrying. David motioned for Emma to stay back, but Max had other plans. The dog lunged forward, barking fiercely, startling Henry and causing him to drop the bag. "Hey!" David shouted, stepping into the clearing with his flashlight aimed at Henry. "What are you doing here?" Henry froze, his hands raised defensively. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said quickly. "Just clearing out some old junk." Emma, unable to contain herself, stepped forward. "Then why were you near our house last night?" she demanded. Henry's eyes darted to her, then to Max, who was still growling. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I haven't been near your house." David narrowed his eyes. "Then you won't mind if I take a look at what's in that bag?" Before Henry could protest, David reached down and opened the bag. Inside were several items, tools, a crowbar, and a flashlight that looked suspiciously out of place. Emma gasped when she recognized one of the items, her mother's locket. "Where did you get this?" David demanded, holding up the locket. Henry stammered, his face pale. I found it. In the woods. I swear." David's expression darkened. "We're going to let the police decide that." "Emma, call the station." Emma nodded, pulling out her phone as Max kept a close watch on Henry. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. The truth was finally coming to light. The next morning, Cedarville was abuzz with the news of Henry Whitman's arrest. The police had taken him in for questioning, and David had handed over the evidence they'd recovered from the abandoned cabin, including Laura's locket. Emma felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that Henry was finally in custody, but anxiety about what might happen next. She knew the fight wasn't over. "Emma, are you ready?" David asked as they prepared to head to the courthouse. Emma nodded, clutching Max's leash tightly. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew Max would be by her side. The Cedarville courthouse was packed that morning. Townsfolk filled the wooden benches, their whispers creating a low hum of curiosity and speculation. Emma walked into the room with her father and Max, feeling the weight of countless eyes on her. She kept her head high, drawing strength from Max's steady presence. At the front of the room sat Judge Eleanor Hayes, her sharp gaze sweeping over the courtroom. Known for her fairness and no-nonsense demeanor, Judge Hayes was someone you didn't want to cross. She called the court to order, and the murmurs died down. Henry Whitman sat at the defense table, his usual gruff demeanor replaced with a look of nervous defiance. His lawyer, a slick man from the city, leaned in close, whispering something to him. Across the aisle, the prosecutor stood ready, a stack of files and evidence spread out before her. "Let's begin," Judge Hayes said, her voice firm. "Prosecution, you may proceed." The prosecutor, a composed woman named Linda Gray, began by laying out the case against Henry. She detailed the evidence recovered from the cabin, including the crowbar, tools, and Laura's locket. She also mentioned the torn fabric Emma had found, which had been sent for analysis. "We believe this fabric, along with other evidence, ties Mr. Whitman to the burglary," Linda said confidently. Henry's lawyer wasted no time trying to dismantle the case. He argued that the items in the cabin didn't directly link his client to the crime and suggested they could have been planted. "My client was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time," he insisted. When it was time for witnesses, Emma was called to the stand. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the witness chair, Max walking beside her. The room seemed to hold its breath as she sat down, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden seat. "Please state your name for the record," Linda said. "Emma Carter." she replied, her voice steady despite her nerves. Linda smiled reassuringly. Emma, can you tell us what happened the night of the burglary? Emma recounted the events carefully, describing the noise outside, Max's behavior, and the shadow she'd seen near the shed. She spoke about finding the torn fabric and how Max had led her to it. As she spoke, her eyes occasionally drifted to Max, who sat calmly by her feet, a grounding presence. The defense lawyer stood to cross-examine her. Emma, he began, his tone smooth but condescending. You're a smart girl, aren't you? Emma nodded cautiously. You've read a lot of detective stories, haven't you? Watched some mystery shows? Yes, Emma admitted. The lawyer smirked. Do you think it's possible that your imagination got the better of you? That maybe you saw something that wasn't really there? Emma clenched her fists. I know what I saw, she said firmly. And Max knew something was wrong. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. Ah, yes, the dog. Max, is it? Are you saying we should rely on a dog's instincts to determine guilt? Emma hesitated, but before she could answer, Max let out a low growl, drawing murmurs from the courtroom. Judge Hayes banged her gavel. Order. The defense lawyer glanced at Max warily but quickly recovered. No further questions, he said, returning to his seat. As the day went on, the prosecution presented more evidence, including the results of the DNA analysis on the torn fabric. The lab confirmed that it matched Henry's profile. This revelation caused a stir in the courtroom, and even Henry seemed momentarily shaken. But the defense wasn't ready to give up. They called Henry to the stand, where he maintained his innocence, claiming he had never been near the Carter home. I don't know how that locket ended up in my bag, he said, his voice rising. I didn't do this. As Henry spoke, Max, who had been quiet most of the day, suddenly stood up. His ears perked, and he fixed his gaze on Henry, letting out a sharp bark. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at the dog. Henry froze, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. His confident facade cracked, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. It's just a dog, he muttered, but his voice wavered. The prosecutor seized the moment. Your Honor, I request a recess to examine the defendant's reaction and the dog's behavior further. There may be more here than meets the eye. Judge Hayes considered the request before nodding. Court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene tomorrow. As the courtroom emptied, Emma felt a flicker of hope. The tide was beginning to turn, and she knew Max had played a crucial role. But the fight wasn't over yet. She glanced at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod. We're getting closer, he said. Emma looked down at Max, his steady eyes meeting hers. We can do this, can't we, boy? She whispered. Max wagged his tail, a silent promise that he would be by her side every step of the way. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the town waited for the trial to resume. Overnight, the DNA match and Max's pointed reaction to Henry had become the talk of Cedarville. Emma, though nervous, felt emboldened by the growing strength of their case. David had reassured her the night before that the truth was coming to light. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there were still pieces of the puzzle missing. The next morning, Emma sat in the living room with Max, her mind racing. There's something we're not seeing, Max, she murmured, stroking his fur. Henry knows more than he's letting on. Max nudged her hand, his gaze steady and calm, as though agreeing. Just then, David entered the room, holding his phone. Emma, the prosecutor just called. He said, they want to revisit the cabin where we found the locket. They think there might be more evidence there. Emma's eyes widened. Can we go with them? David hesitated but finally nodded. All right, but you stay close to me. And Max, of course. Later that afternoon, Emma, David, Max, and the prosecutor arrived at the old cabin. The place looked as desolate as ever, with its peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The air was heavy with an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The prosecutor, Linda Gray, turned to David. The police already searched this place once. But given Henry's reaction in court yesterday, I think we may have missed something. Max led the way as the group entered the cabin. Emma kept close behind him, watching as he sniffed the air and began to explore. The interior was as grim as the exterior, dusty shelves, broken furniture, and cobwebs in every corner. "Look around," Linda instructed. "Anything out of place or unusual?" David examined a pile of tools while Linda checked an old trunk in the corner. Emma, meanwhile, noticed Max circling a section of the floor near the back of the cabin. He barked sharply, his paws scratching at the wooden boards. "What is it, Max?" Emma asked, crouching beside him. David came over, shining his flashlight on the floor. "Looks like a loose board," he said, using his pocket knife to pry it up. Beneath the board was a small compartment, and inside it, a cloth bag tied with string. Linda's eyes narrowed as she reached for the bag and opened it carefully. Inside were several items: a stack of cash, a gold bracelet, and a silver watch. Emma gasped. "That bracelet? It's Mrs. Thompson's. She said it was stolen last month." Linda nodded grimly. "These must be items from other burglaries. This ties Henry to more than just your case." David frowned. Why would he hide them here? Why not take them somewhere safer? Linda sighed. Because he didn't think anyone would find them, and maybe he didn't plan to use this place alone. Emma tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Linda hesitated before replying. Henry might have had help. Someone else could be involved. Back at the courthouse, the new evidence was presented to Judge Hayes. The discovery of the stolen items was a significant blow to Henry's defense. His lawyer argued that the items could have been planted, but the mounting evidence against Henry was difficult to ignore. However, the idea of an accomplice changed the direction of the case. The prosecutor began questioning Henry more aggressively about his connections. "Mr. Whitman," Linda asked, "can you explain why stolen items were found hidden in a cabin you've been seen frequenting?" Henry, looking pale and cornered, stammered, I don't know how they got there. Maybe someone's setting me up." Linda leaned forward. "And who would do that? Who else had access to the cabin?" Henry remained silent, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. Max, sitting beside Emma, growled softly, drawing attention from the courtroom. "Mr. Whitman," Linda pressed, her voice firm, "if you had an accomplice, now is the time to tell the truth." Henry's shoulders slumped. "All right," he muttered. "It wasn't just me. I didn't break into the Carter's house. Someone else did." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Hayes banged her gavel for order. "Who was it?" Linda demanded. Henry hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Finally, he muttered a name. "Caleb." Emma's heart stopped. "Caleb? The boy from the gas station?" Henry nodded. "He gave me tips on which houses to hit. He said the Carters wouldn't be home that night. He's the one who told me about the shed." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Caleb, the friendly teenager who had seemed so harmless, was now implicated in the case. The police were immediately sent to bring him in for questioning. As the session adjourned for the day, Emma sat in stunned silence. She had trusted Caleb, and now she felt betrayed. "How could he do this?" she whispered. David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people aren't who they seem, Emma, but we'll get to the bottom of this." Max nudged her hand, as if reminding her that he was still there, her loyal protector in the midst of the chaos. The courtroom was abuzz with shock following Henry Whitman's confession. The mention of Caleb, the friendly teenager Emma and Lily had trusted, as a potential accomplice, sent ripples of disbelief through Cedarville. Emma felt her stomach twist. Caleb had seemed so helpful, so normal. Could he really have been part of this? That evening, back at home, David paced the living room while Emma sat on the couch, staring blankly at Max, who lay curled at her feet. "Why would Caleb do something like this?" she asked softly. David sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know. Emma. But people don't always show their true colors. Sometimes desperation makes them do things they wouldn't normally do. But he helped us, Emma argued, her voice tinged with frustration. He gave me information about Henry. Maybe he was trying to divert suspicion away from himself, David suggested. Or maybe he didn't think you'd find anything. Emma shook her head, struggling to reconcile the Caleb she thought she knew with the boy Henry had described. Max let out a low whine, resting his head on her knee as if to comfort her. I just want to understand, Emma murmured, stroking Max's fur. The next day, the police brought Caleb in for questioning. Emma and David watched from a distance as the boy was escorted into the station. Emma's heart felt heavy as she saw Caleb's usually confident demeanor replaced by a nervous, hunched posture. Later that afternoon, Prosecutor Linda Gray addressed the court. We've questioned Caleb Turner regarding Mr. Whitman's claims, she began. While Caleb denies any involvement in the burglaries, there are inconsistencies in his story. Additionally, we've obtained new evidence from the cabin. Linda paused for effect before continuing. A fingerprint belonging to Caleb Turner was found on the flashlight recovered from the cabin. This places him at the scene where the stolen items were hidden. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. It was true Caleb had been involved. The defense lawyer immediately objected, arguing that Caleb's fingerprints could have been on the flashlight from an earlier, innocent interaction. But the weight of the evidence was undeniable. When Caleb was called to the stand, the atmosphere grew even tenser. The once lively boy now seemed deflated, his voice barely above a whisper as he answered questions. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he admitted, his voice cracking. Henry, he pressured me. He needed money, and I didn't think anyone would get hurt. Linda's eyes narrowed. So you admit you provided information about the Carter family to Mr. Whitman? Caleb hesitated before nodding. Yes, but I swear I didn't go into their house. That was all Henry. Emma's fists clenched at her sides. But you told him about us, she thought, anger bubbling beneath her sadness. You let him target us. After Caleb's testimony, the case against Henry Whitman grew stronger. The court adjourned for the day, leaving the townspeople to buzz with speculation and outrage. Emma, however, felt no relief. Instead, she felt betrayed and confused. That evening, David sat beside her on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. I know this is a lot to process, he said gently. It's hard to find out someone you trusted isn't who they seemed. Emma nodded, staring out at the fading light. I just don't understand how someone could do something so awful and then act like everything's fine. Sometimes people make bad choices because they think it's the only option they have, David said. It doesn't excuse what Caleb did, but it might help you understand why. Max nudged Emma's hand with his nose, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked down at him, his amber eyes steady and reassuring. You knew something was wrong from the start, didn't you? She whispered. Max wagged his tail slightly, as if to say, I've always got your back. The trial was far from over, but with Caleb's admission and the mounting evidence against Henry, the scales of justice were tipping. As Emma went to bed that night, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with Max by her side, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The courtroom was packed the next day as Caleb Turner returned for further questioning. His earlier confession had shaken the town, and everyone wanted to know the full extent of his involvement. Emma sat beside her father, her hands gripping Max's leash tightly. She felt a swirl of emotions, betrayal, anger, and a faint sense of pity for Caleb. Max, as always, rested calmly at her feet, his presence grounding her. Judge Eleanor Hayes called the court to order. Caleb Turner, you've admitted to providing information to Henry Whitman about potential targets for burglary. Today, we will seek to understand the full scope of your actions. Caleb stood at the witness stand, his posture slouched and his face pale. His lawyer stood beside him, whispering instructions. but Caleb looked too defeated to fully absorb them. Prosecutor Linda Gray approached Caleb with an air of quiet determination. "Mr. Turner," she began, her voice measured, "you've already admitted to helping Henry Whitman. Can you clarify exactly how you were involved?" Caleb swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. I told him which houses would be empty," he said quietly. "He'd come into the gas station late at night and ask me about the neighborhood, who was home, who had nice things. I thought he was just curious at first. But then he started talking about how he needed money." Linda's expression remained neutral, but her tone grew sharper. "And what about the Carter family? How did he learn about them?" Caleb hesitated, glancing nervously at Emma. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he mumbled. "He overheard me talking about Mr. Carter being out late at work and that Emma's mom had passed away. He said it sounded like an easy target." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Emma's stomach churned. She couldn't believe how casually her family's vulnerability had been exploited. As Caleb continued his testimony, Max suddenly tensed. His ears perked up, and a low growl escaped his throat. The courtroom went silent, all eyes turning toward the dog. Emma instinctively placed a hand on Max's head, trying to calm him, but he remained focused on Caleb, his growl growing louder. Linda seized the moment. "Your Honor," she said, turning to Judge Hayes. "It's clear that Max is reacting to Caleb's presence, given Max's training and his previous reactions. I'd like to bring in an expert to analyze his behavior." Judge Hayes raised an eyebrow but nodded. "I'll allow it. This court will reconvene tomorrow after the expert's assessment." As the session ended, Emma felt a flicker of hope. Max's instincts had been right all along, and now they might finally have the chance to prove it. The next day, the courtroom was even more crowded as Dr. Andrew Whitaker, a renowned animal behaviorist, took the stand. Dressed in a simple suit, he carried an air of quiet authority. Max sat beside Emma, his eyes fixed on the new stranger, but his body relaxed. Dr. Whitaker began by explaining his process. Dogs like Max are trained to detect subtle changes in human behavior, body language, and even scent. Their reactions are rarely random, especially in high-stress environments like this. Linda nodded. "And based on what you've observed, do you believe Max's reaction to Caleb Turner is significant?" Dr. Whitaker turned toward Max, who was now sitting attentively. "Absolutely," he replied. "Max has shown consistent signs of alertness and unease whenever he's near individuals linked to the crime. This suggests he's picking up on something, whether it's a familiar scent from the night of the burglary or the emotional state of the individuals involved." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Linda pressed further. "Dr. Whitaker, could Max's reaction be used to strengthen the case against Caleb and Henry?" Dr. Whitaker nodded. "While it's not definitive proof, it strongly supports the idea that Max is recognizing something about these individuals that aligns with his training to detect threats and danger." The testimony from Dr. Whitaker added a new layer of credibility to Max's behavior. Caleb's lawyer tried to discredit the findings, but the weight of the evidence was too much. Caleb, already on edge, began to crack. As Linda pressed him further, Caleb's composure crumbled. "All right," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I knew what Henry was planning. Okay, I didn't think he'd actually go through with it, but I didn't stop him either." The room erupted in gasps, and Judge Hayes banged her gavel for order. "Mr. Turner," she said sternly, "you will explain yourself fully." Caleb slumped back in his seat, tears streaming down his face. "He said he just needed a quick score to pay off some debts," he confessed. "I didn't think he'd hurt anyone. I swear, I didn't know he'd take things so far." With Caleb's full confession on record, the case against Henry Whitman grew even stronger. However, Linda wasn't done. "Your Honor," she said, "there's one more piece of evidence we need to present. The results of the fingerprint analysis on the crowbar found in the cabin." Judge Hayes nodded. "Proceed." Linda held up a document. The fingerprints on the crowbar belonged to Henry Whitman. confirming it was used during the Carter burglary. This ties him directly to the crime. The revelation sent a shockwave through the room. Henry's lawyer looked defeated, and Henry himself sat pale and silent. As the session adjourned for the day, Emma felt a sense of relief for the first time in weeks. Max had been right all along, and now the truth was finally coming to light. As she left the courthouse with her father and Max, she couldn't help but feel a newfound sense of strength. The journey wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to justice. The courtroom was silent as Linda Gray prepared her final arguments. Emma sat next to her father, her hand resting on Max's head. The tension in the room was palpable as the pieces of the case came together. Caleb Turner's confession, the fingerprints on the crowbar, and the stolen items found in the cabin all pointed to Henry Whitman's guilt. But the courtroom still held its breath, waiting for the final word. Linda addressed the jury with clarity and conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence. You've seen how Henry Whitman exploited the vulnerability of a grieving family, targeted their home, and involved a young man in his scheme. The stolen items, the fingerprints, and the confession all tell the same story. Henry Whitman is guilty of this crime." She turned slightly toward Henry, her tone softening but remaining firm. "This isn't just about stolen possessions. It's about the fear and trauma inflicted on a young girl and her family. Emma Carter deserves justice, and it's up to you to deliver it." Henry's lawyer countered, attempting to sow doubt in the jury's mind. He argued that Caleb had admitted his involvement and that Henry's role was exaggerated. But the argument felt thin, and even Henry's own body language betrayed his unease. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Henry Whitman, guilty of burglary, conspiracy, and endangering a minor." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Emma clutched Max's leash tightly, her heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of fear lift from her shoulders. Judge Hayes addressed Henry directly, her tone firm. "Mr. Whitman, your actions have caused significant harm, not just to the Carter family but to this community. You exploited trust and manipulated others for your own gain. I sentence you to 12 years in state prison." Henry's face fell, and the room buzzed with whispers. Caleb Turner, while receiving a lighter sentence for his cooperation, was ordered to complete community service and attend mandatory counseling. Outside the courthouse, Emma stood with her father and Max as reporters and townsfolk gathered around. David placed a protective arm around her. "You did it, Emma," he said quietly. Emma looked down at Max, tears brimming in her eyes. "No, we did it." She knelt down, wrapping her arms around Max, who wagged his tail gently. That evening, the Carters returned home, their small house finally feeling like a place of peace again. Emma placed Laura's locket on the mantelpiece, her heart swelling with a bittersweet mix of sadness and relief. "Max," she said as she lay on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder, "you're more than my dog. You're my hero." In the weeks that followed, Emma's story spread beyond Cedarville. The bond between Emma and Max, along with their role in solving the case, inspired people across the state. Donations poured in to support local therapy dog programs, and the Carters received letters of encouragement from strangers. One day, a representative from a national animal rights organization visited Emma at her home. "We'd love for you and Max to speak at our upcoming event," the woman said. "Your story shows just how incredible therapy dogs can be." Emma hesitated, but David nudged her gently. "You have a voice, Emma. Use it." At the event, Emma stood nervously on stage, Max by her side. But as she looked out at the crowd, she found strength in Max's calm presence. She spoke about her journey, the fear she had overcome, and the unbreakable bond she shared with Max. The audience erupted into applause, and Emma felt a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Weeks later, Emma received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Caleb. He apologized for his actions. explaining that he'd been manipulated by Henry and was desperate to pay off his debts. "I know I can't undo what I've done," the letter read, "but I want you to know how sorry I am." Emma showed the letter to her father, unsure of how to respond. David knelt beside her. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Emma. It's about letting go so you can move forward." After much thought, Emma wrote back. Her letter was brief but sincere. She told Caleb she forgave him, not for his sake but for her own. Cedarville held a small celebration to honor Emma and Max. The mayor presented Max with a medal for his bravery, and Emma was given a plaque recognizing her courage. The townsfolk cheered, their faith in their community restored. Emma stood on the small stage, holding Max's leash. She looked out at the crowd, then down at her loyal companion. "This is for you, Max," she whispered. Months later, Emma and Max began volunteering with a local therapy dog organization. They visited schools and hospitals, sharing their story and helping others find comfort and strength. One afternoon, as Emma and Max walked through the park, she noticed a group of children playing with a puppy. The sight made her smile. "Come on, Max," she said, leading him toward the children. "Let's show them what a real hero looks like." As the sun set over Cedarville, Emma felt a sense of peace. Her journey had been difficult, but it had also shown her the power of resilience, love, and forgiveness. With Max by her side, she knew she could face whatever the future held. Together, they had turned a moment of fear into a lifetime of hope, and that was just the beginning.